Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, here we are on the third session of Burnout to Barakah. Today it's going to be about something that all of us, including myself, also struggle with, which is to let go and let be. This is essentially tawakkul, essentially surrendering things that we cannot control to Allah SWT. And there is a process to it. There is a certain number of steps that we have to take in ourselves, doing the hard work on ourselves in order for us to make this a natural habit, something that we can easily, in a sense, surrender once we've put in effort in whatever that we do, inshallah. No, but before we move towards today's session on Let Go and Let Be, type in the chats, how did your scheduled pauses help you this week? Yeah, so it's either whether you choose to journal, whether you choose to just breathe more, whether it's about dua and zikir. Just type in the chats as I go through the slides, inshallah, and then we can reflect on that later on. Alright, so I just want to share with you about this particular book. It's called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. It's written by Bronnie Ware, and she is not a Muslim, but she's actually a nurse. She's a nurse at a hospice, and she basically takes care of people with terminal illness and elderly, who are just waiting for the time to leave this world. And throughout the conversations that she have with these patients, she identified or narrowed down the top 5 regrets that they have. And they are, number 1, which is they wish they had the courage to live a life true to themselves and not the life that others expect of them. And I think this is something that we can all relate to, right? We tend to lean towards social expectations of ourselves instead of what we internally and innately want to do for ourselves, our family, and things like that. And number 2 is I wish I hadn't worked so hard, which is exactly why we're here for Burnout to Barakah, right? A lot of us are just working too hard, in a sense, working beyond the capacity that we have as humans. And the third one is I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. And this is something that I think most of us really relate to, because we grow up kind of like really wanting to please others and wanting to perform in a certain way, and that's why we suppress our emotions instead of understanding it, acknowledging it, and regulating, right? Really practicing sabr to regulate, which is what we covered last session, alhamdulillah. So for the fourth one, which is I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. I think this is something that all of us can relate in terms of adulting, right? I think the deeper we get into this kind of like adult life and the expectations and responsibilities that we have, we tend to kind of like just move away from the friendships that we have, or like some form of social settings that can be good for us. So, but alhamdulillah, here we are, for Burnout to Barakah. We're together, going through reflection. This is a kind of social setting that's good for us, good for our well-being, alhamdulillah. But of course, there are friendships that are okay for us to kind of like take a step back from. Any toxic friendship or relationships, it's good to get away from them when they're not healthy for our well-being. But in general, I think the social side, the healthy social side, tend to go to the back seat, especially with social media being kind of like more of the prominent side of social for most of us. And this is something that we can learn from this book, right? And the fifth one is I wish I had let myself be happier. And I think this particular one is something that I want to highlight, because most of us feel that whatever that's happening in our lives, right, it's happening to us, right? And I think this is something we shared last session, where we talk about how our actions are the one, in a sense, decides where we want to go and where we're heading towards. So having a life that's happier, being a joyful life and all that is a choice. It's a choice, it's an action, it's something that we choose to do and work towards. So for a lot of people, we get ourselves drowned in burnout, drowned in resentment, drowned in like not feeling in control or in charge of our lives. And this is obviously something that, you know, we will regret if we don't take action. So alhamdulillah, here we are, addressing these things, right? So I highly recommend reading this book, especially at the end of the year, where we kind of like really want to look back into our lives and stuff like that, and this is a good reminder in a sense. So yeah, why am I sharing about this is that because in Surah Yunus, Allah SWT reminds us that He does not wrong people in the least, but it is people who wrong themselves. Like, that's exactly what these regrets were telling us, right? I mean, this is the choices that we make in our lives that make us regret the life that we live. It's never, in a sense, like if we really lead our lives by the Quran, lead our lives based on what is pleasing to Allah SWT, I don't think we will ever say that we regret living that way, because whatever that comes our way from Allah SWT is good. There's higher, right? There's goodness to it. So if we were to actually frame our life to be Allah centric, then our life changes. Like, we become more focused, right? Because we are not distracted by the dunya in a sense, and not distracted by all these kind of like human tendencies that we have, and we get to be more content, of course, right? Like we have this deep sense of contentment, because we are doing things for Him and according to what He feels is best for us. And whatever He feels is best for us, it is indeed best for us, right? Because He knows best. So knowing this, like conceptually, is really important for us to move towards letting go and letting be being natural. In order for tawakkul to be natural is for us to trust that, you know, He does not wrong us, but it's our choices that lead us to a certain direction. So this is a quote by Stephen R. Covey, which talks about how I know he's the one who wrote the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and it's a really old book, but it's based on like really a couple of human studies, like studies on human conditioning. And what he says is that basically, if you want to make minor changes in your life, you focus on your attitudes and behaviors. So change the things, your kind of like minute habits and things like that. But if you want to have a significant change in your life, a transformation, you have to work on your basic paradigms. So what does this mean? If you look at the first 2 sessions, right, what we've been doing was in a sense like kind of like observe our reactions and also kind of like add pauses into our lives. So those are the minor changes in your life that in a sense you can see that there's a bit of difference, right? Like you mentioned about how you feel a little bit lighter, you feel a bit more calmer, alhamdulillah, you know, all this you kind of feel in a sense there is a certain number of change, a certain level of change. But if we wanted to really transform ourselves towards really relying on Allah SWT in all aspects of life, in even the littlest things, we have to actually change our lens towards Aqidah, towards understanding of Allah SWT, instead of what we've been conditioned towards. And how do we change this lens? Is first to understand that Allah SWT is ever kind to His servants. He provides abundantly to whoever He wills. Even for people who do not prioritize Him, He gives us, right? Even when we are not thinking of Him, He gives us, right? But we will not be able to see these attributes of Him, this goodness, His mercy, His kindness, when we don't see them in ourselves. And what do I mean by this is because we are a creation of Allah SWT, right? So we carry His attributes. We carry His greatness because it's not that we are great, it's more of like because He is great, you know, we as a creation is there's good attributes in us. But we are not able to, if we are not able to see that in ourselves, then it's very hard for us to see in Him in a deep level of understanding. So why is that so? Is because of our self-criticism, right? We talk about this throughout the past 2 weeks. We talk about we tend to be harsh on ourselves, we tend to be mean to ourselves, we tend to kind of like really criticize ourselves for over like mistakes or even the small minute ones, right? And what we want to do is to actually shift towards self-compassion. And in order to shift towards self-compassion, there is a process, because especially if we have been self-criticizing ourselves for many years, it will be very hard to suddenly tell ourselves that, hey, you can be gentle on yourself, be kind to yourself, and things like that, because it feels very unnatural. It feels very weird and awkward in order for us to talk nicely to ourselves again, right? It's just like, you have someone who you've been pretty harsh on because that person has been making you mad and all the kind of stuff, and then you suddenly want to be nice again to that person. It feels very awkward and weird to suddenly just speak gently to the person, right? Things like that. I mean, this is just an example, of course, but it's the same thing for ourselves, right? So what we want to do right now is more on practicing kindness first. And today, letting go and letting be is all about practicing kindness on ourselves, to let go and let be of things that we cannot control. And then once this becomes a habit, once this kind of like really solidify in our habits, in our way of seeing ourselves, then we can move towards practicing mindfulness. That means to be constantly aware of the fact that Allah SWT hears all and sees all, He's all knowing of everything that's going on, even in our heads, and also, and choose actions that's pleasing to Him. To have that level of mindfulness, we have to first practice kindness. So what do I mean by practicing kindness? First and foremost is to understand where self-criticism comes from, which is something that we learn in childhood and also conditioned by the society. So for example, let's say, as a kid, we're always being yelled for having a messy room. What our brain, in a sense, learn is that if I yell to myself, maybe I'll be able to clean my room, right? So whenever we see the mess of our kids, right, we have this tendency of like kind of like want to yell at our kids, or yell at how messy everything is. This is kind of like, it's just a reaction that we have. And of course, the other example is like, this whole idea of beauty, right? It's something that it's not just something that we hear from other people. It's something that we also see in the media, and that's why we kind of like judge our body, so that thinking that maybe by judging our body, by being hard on ourselves, by saying that we're not skinny enough, we're not pretty enough, and things like that, then one day we will be beautiful enough. Thinking that the brain learns that if I criticize it myself, I'll do better and be happier. But of course, that's not how it works, right? What happens during self-criticism is that it actually shuts down the learning pathways. Like, it doesn't help you improve, right? It keeps you stuck. And not only that, it actually adds silent stress to your system, because every single time we criticize ourselves, we are actually activating our stress hormones. And not being aware of this happening in ourselves, that's when we are not aware of how like all this chronic internal stress is actually affecting our mental health, our emotional well-being, our physical well-being. Right now we can only see as maybe fatigue, or kind of like just low level amount of stress and things like that. But when we are in our 60s, and I think I mentioned this before, like we see right now stress is something that our body, in a sense, can manage, but over time, over years and years and years of exposing ourselves to this silent stress, right, that's when all these chronic illnesses will come up. And that's usually when we are much older, right, when we don't have that ability and capacity to repair as easy as we do right now. So, but the deeper sense of it is that we are also criticizing a creation of Allah SWT, when actually our responsibility, our amanah, the trust, what He entrusted us to do is to preserve and to protect, right? So how do we do that? How do we preserve and protect ourselves? Which is to practice kindness. And practicing kindness is not like affirmation like, like I am good enough, I am pretty, I can do this, things like that. All this affirmation actually feels more like a lie. Like, we feel, our brain is very, very smart. Our brain knows that if it believes that we're not doing enough, and then if we keep telling ourselves otherwise, we're just kind of like lying to ourselves. And that's why affirmation doesn't really work. It has this in a sense, just kind of like a fleeting effect, but it doesn't work in a deeper sense. So practicing kindness is literally just acknowledging your feelings. So for example, I'm feeling a little bit anxious right now. Yeah, so that's you acknowledging your feelings. Um you're being honest with yourself, right? And then you take the blame of you as a person and place it on the action. So why am I feeling anxious, right? So it's not because I'm an anxious person, but instead I am feeling a little bit nervous about a meeting that's going to happen tomorrow, something like that. Or like for example, and then from there, then you can think, okay, what can help me, what can make me less anxious? Maybe I could write down some pointers for the meeting so that I'm more clear, and my mind is a little bit clearer for the meeting. Example, um, for example, or another example be, let's say you didn't wake up for subuh, you didn't wake up for fajr, right? um, Instead of like, oh, like here I am, I'm a bad Muslim, I can't even wake up for fajr, I can't even solat for 2 rakaat. Like, what's the point of just what's the point of trying, things like that. That is what self-criticism does to you. But if you were to practice kindness, you can first is of course istighfar, like ask for forgiveness for missing fajr or missing subuh, and then kind of like just see what is it that probably has caused you to miss fajr. Maybe you didn't set an alarm clock, or maybe it was a rough night, your toddler keep on waking up, or is it because you didn't sleep early enough, things like that. And then once we kind of like look at it as like what's the action that causes this, you just kind of like remove it from you as a person, that you're to blame, things like that. And then from there, that's when it encourages learning from the experiences, and then that's when you take a different action, you make a different choice. Let's say you set an alarm, maybe with a little bit more snooze buttons and things like that. So what we are essentially doing is to shift from a reactive language, like, oh, I can't even wake up for subuh, oh, I have to go for the meeting tomorrow, or like, if only I have a maid, and then my house is not going to be messy, things like that, to a more proactive language that says, I can wake up for subuh, I just need to set up an alarm, 5 alarms maybe, or I will go for the meeting with clarity because I've written down the things that I want to address during the meeting, for example. Okay, so this is one phrase that you can start off with, which is, I may not be able to, but I can. What this phrase does is that it helps you to kind of like learn to let go of the things that you cannot control. So for example, I may not be able to control my kids to make them sleep on time, but I can keep the sleep routine consistent. So you kind of remove yourself from the areas that you cannot control, and then focus on the things that you can control. And what happens when you keep on doing this routinely and more consistently is that you start to see that there are things that you have to do and you have to focus on, but there are things that actually you can really just let go and not put so much responsibility, so much attention on. And how are you able to see this is you can actually start writing down, or if you have the time, is to make this urgency importance matrix. So this particular matrix helps you to kind of like see 4 quadrants, 4 types of tabs that's in your head, right? Things that are urgent and important, obviously you have to focus, you have to do it right now, or be something that you schedule, you put in into this to-do list, right? To-do list. But there are also things that are not urgent, but they are important. For example, things that are important for your well-being, right? It might not be urgent now, but it will help you kind of like push through what's urgent and important. So for example, like this session, right? This session you schedule in, so you make sure that you have this reflection session for your well-being. And then you start to see there are things that are seemingly urgent, but not important. So this is an example of notifications on your phone, right? They always seem like they're urgent, but technically they're not important to your daily lives, right? That notification by Shopee, that notification by Foodpanda, things like that. All these things you can actually minimize, just remove them, right? Slowly. And then obviously there are things that you start to see that are not urgent and not important. And this is obviously where social media comes in, right? Technically they're not urgent, they're not really important. But we put them into a priority sometimes, and it becomes a habit that it goes to a different quadrant where it actually doesn't belong, right? So if you do have the time this week, I really highly recommend that you do these two exercise, which is I may not be able to what, but I can what. Practice this on a daily basis as much as you can. And then whenever you have at least about half an hour to yourself, just kind of do these metrics and just look into the things that you run into on a daily basis and would you put them in the quadrant. And this is how you get to see, there are things that actually you can kind of like minimize and avoid. And that's where you get to see the amount of time and energy that you can gain for things that matter, things that are more important. Yeah, so inshallah, these are the two practices that you can do for this week. And now we go on to the reflection, which is what's one thing you can let go, let be right now.